Jackanory, Jackanory, Jackanory. I'll tell you the story of Jackanory, and now my story's begun. I'll tell you another of Jack and his brother, and now my story's done. So when we last spoke on episode 1, I was talking about a board game that was edible being brought by my Uncle David, who dropped it off in Washway Road with my grandma and my Auntie Meg, and the rest of the family were away working. And this would always occur on Sunday afternoon, on weekend afternoons, I should think. And then again on Sunday. That's right, 3 o'clock on Friday. And then it came Sunday as well, but that was earlier in the day because nobody was working then. So 6 months after my favourite board game was first brought, so that I could play it with Grandma and Uncle David, he dropped off a very elaborate doll's pram. He'd earlier brought a bright orange Disney card the year before, which I particularly liked at Christmas time, and he added on this time the name of his 2 daughters, Emma and Lorna, who were 4 and 6 years older than me respectively, but I didn't get to see them back then, and the rest of the family would only get to see them at his funeral and just one other time in which I saw them, because they spent more time with their mum. A week after this tragedy struck, because my mum had to drive to a hospital when she picked me up from school, and she told me that Uncle David had suffered a heart attack, but something told me back then it was pretty serious, and it was the first time I'd heard of a heart attack being 6 years old, but I suspected it was something very, very serious and that he'd die. I should have held out more hope, and I felt almost guilty that I didn't as a child, but it all seemed so bad, and this is exactly what happened. He did die, and his 2 daughters were left without a father before they even began secondary school, and I was left without an uncle that I'd been fond of, and it was brought to me at that time that the fact that I was there in time and space and my family were there alive in time and space was arbitrary and not a certainty, because I knew that my dad had something wrong with him as well, because he was always in hospital. And I maybe should have known there was only a 30% chance of him surviving, because he had a type of lymphoma known as Hodgkin's disease, which was a type of blood cancer. And I'd been told that he had something wrong with his blood, and that was a deficiency. And I'd related that it was serious, and that it was somehow connected with me, because I'd suffered from moderately severe anemia as a kid, which left me to, get loads and loads of viruses, and that's why I got scarlet fever and why my temperature rocketed to 105. And it was quite a long, drawn out attend Christie's, and I more recently was a carer in the early 2000s to someone who had to go to Christie's, but that we saw Professor Lorrigan at the time, but that he wasn't as lucky as my dad. My dad had later remarked that other people that he was in Christie's with at the time were not as lucky. upstairs or downstairs. He developed 2 secondary tumours in his stomach, and from one that had initially developed in his groin. So it was a secondary cancer, but because he was my dad, I didn't think he'd die, because even at 6 you don't expect to lose a parent, because you think they're somehow special, and he didn't. He remitted, but it was touch and go, really, to be honest. And my mum hid the word cancer from me. I thought I'd somehow inherited a blood condition which, albeit less severe, was still there. I thought I'd picked it up from him at just 6 years old, and I thought, oh, I'm going to die as an adult, because, let's face it, my dad was only in his very early 40s when he first had the cancer, and I thought that the white cells would take over my faulty red corpuscles. And I remember being quite morbid and dwelling on this while I was playing on my swing, where I should have been happier and playing with my next door neighbour, who was my age or a year younger even, and was good fun. And he was a year and 1 month younger, being born at the start of November, and it would take my mind off things, but there was something depressive. But I was relating it to myself and thinking of the future, which was quite advanced at only 6. I had quite a wild imagination back then. I probably still have. My intuition told me things back then, and my scarlet fever bout gave me a temperature of 105, which is pretty much how hot it feels tonight, or in the early hours. And it taught me about, because it's pretty sky high, 105 as a temperature, so it taught me about the fine line between life and death. And and because I liked history books back then, the Victorian age, etc., even at 6 or 7, you'd think, oh, if I wasn't living in an advanced state and I was in a previous life or whatever, that's going to get me. But to be honest, my Uncle David was the first person I was fond of to have crossed this invisible white thread. And with most people, it's grandparents, I would have thought. Unfortunately, things happen, but 6 is fairly young, but at least it wasn't a parent. And sometimes we have this collective sense of hereditary, and I've studied about nature, and animals can pick up sort of memory patterns that are innate from their recent ancestors and from their, going back a couple of generations. And people think it's past lives, but it might be something to do with a collective unconscious that has somehow sort of crossed into the DNA. And there's an awareness which science can't really put its finger on quite at the moment, and we think it's past lives. It might be recent ancestors, because that's what happens in the animal kingdom with birds and animals. They'll instinctively follow something that their parents or parents have picked up in regard to survival. But as a kid, I used to think it was Angel Gabriel, and he, unbeknown the to everyone else, had imparted wisdom to me at an early age, and I acquired this special knowledge. But that would only serve to make people with inner demons who hadn't really actualized, even if they were teachers. They could be, most teachers were all right, or just shades of grey like everyone else, but you could get the odd vicious teacher who was envious or didn't understand a bright kid. Most of us are innocents in this big universe, but some of us actually develop a mission to be totally unpleasant because, others break through from challenges. It leads to spiritual growth early on, so they make an implicit decision in their young minds to be spiritual leaders or aspire to be spiritual leaders. I was starting to develop compassion as soon as my reading skills expanded, and I was free to read books because I was an only child with older relatives, and my mum was out working. I'd be round with my grandmother in her big house. I could have all the space I wanted to and all the freedom I wanted to read books undisturbed by siblings for a much older age group at around the time of 7. I remember reading The Briar and the Rose at 7, and it had a scarlet cover, and it had a kind of velvet texture to it. So I connected the redness of the blood to, and the texture of it to iron. The liver that I was given to improve my blood count. I was on table 2 of 8 tables, meaning I was one of the quickest academically, but I saw the growth of compassion quite early because I didn't agree. I'm not woke and I'm not particularly enlightened, but I was enlightened for a kid. I would say I was maybe a bit woke, but not to an extreme degree. I'm not extreme, and I do not agree with, even at 6, I didn't agree with segregating kids because of their reading ability. But the teacher was quite benign. She didn't pick on kids. It was just in the very late 70s, they are not teaching methods and hadn't evolved and weren't as politically correct as they are now, basically. But even as a child, I could work it out that that's a bit wrong. It should be a bit mix and match, not the slowest readers being kept right at the back. That's ridiculous. So it did seem a bit Victorian, even though the teacher didn't particularly offend me or pick on any kids. They were just kept separately. I was culturally and ethnically aware because for a short time I lived in a built-up town near Manchester, fairly near Manchester, about 8 miles away. And when I came to a rural place, it was more closed and cut off. So I was naturally enlightened, I think, because if other kids spotted difference, I ignored it in favour of being compassionate, but my compassion was more moved towards a child on my table who had a problem with his liver. I could sense that this was problematic at such a tender age. He was quiet and intelligent and kind, and yet he had a jaundiced look, and my heart reached out to him because I knew something was wrong. I thought to myself how good it would be to actually help kids that were sicker than him back then, and maybe try and help out in a children's hospice. But it's not something I could do now with children. I could do it with elderly people. And I have helped, cared for someone that was terminally ill, as I said, and my dad was terminally ill as well when I was younger. But that was when I was a young adult, because he got over the Hodgkin's disease. But wanting to help other kids the same age that were very sick is a sign that my sensitivities were expanding and I was compassionate. So that's why I felt an old soul. It wasn't because I picked up a lot of viruses and had experience. It was because I'd read a lot. I felt about 60, even though it was obviously quite hardy to sort of get through these illnesses and get better. And I obviously was only young and not as physically strong as an adult, but I felt like I was an old soul. And I'd heard of the word hospice from somewhere, but I don't know why. But maybe my dad had mentioned it in the worst case scenario, and I hadn't thought I'd remembered. But because I was sort of listening, it had filtered through into my subconscious, and the same applied with the name Sigmund Freud, because there's no way that would have been taught in lessons, and not all of what he said, especially with regard to guys, young lads, I would agree with, but it was or some of the other things he did, but there was something to the Electra complex, because I think I had that with I would be irrational in jumping to the defence of my dad when my mum told him off for being lackadaisical and dropping his tie in his soup, but he only just got round from being ill, so he had a bit of an excuse. At the time, initially, I thought, oh, well, my mum's probably right, he's being a bit lazy, because my mum dumbed down the severity of his illness to me, even though I knew something was very wrong and he had to spend time away in hospital. I wasn't really familiar with cancer as a illness. I just thought it was something severely wrong with his blood. But I would have a go at my mum after a while. And I actually thought she was in the right, but I would irrationally defend my father, going against what I thought was my better judgment. Or if my mum asked me about how attractive she was, I would sort of not say that she was. Or if we had a young attractive teaching assistant, that would get on my nerves, and I don't know why. And so some bits of what Freud said were accurate, and others were a bit distasteful and probably not accurate in my view. It's something innate that he was describing, and it's because the brain hasn't developed properly to work out the difference with young children, and they do go through different learning stages. And I think why people sort of regress in their behaviour back to people from much earlier civilizations is because they haven't successfully completed these life stages as children. And there's something of the child still there, whereas I'd probably be questioning irrationality at 6 or 7, and this is why sometimes you get mob law, and in unevolved societies that will actually prevail. And as we can see from past history, it's not because people are intrinsically evil. I think it's because they haven't had the chance to educate themselves as children, or they haven't had that level of attention, and they're not able to pass through those formative stages of learning and development fully. So there is an immature, uncivilized aspect to them, which is why society is so chaotic, especially now. The level of education must be, it's all about targets, but not actually about proper learning. And you know, because it's frightening to think that I'm questioning and trying to become more rational as a infant, and yet people, grown men and women, will not question that. I afterwards I thought, this is being a bit bitchy. Actually, I would prefer older women teaching me to younger women, because they were attractive as a young child, because they were more grandmotherly and like my older relatives. And I thought, because I was just a young kid, I make a better ballet dancer than my mum, because I was small at the time. But it's probably the situation's reversed now. Apart from my mum not having the strength to even walk, she's tiny now. So I had developed spirituality and compassion in advance, and I would actually find it difficult to work in a children's hospice. As some of you know, my partner lost his child at 3 years old and never got over it. And you could, as a child, you can work with other children because they're your own peer group, but it's hard to work as an adult with children in a hospice. But I could easily do it with elderly people, because that's what's expected, and I've done that kind of thing before. It would have been a very worthy thing for a young child to do, to volunteer to do, but I think it was because of my dad, and because I knew just a little bit of what it was like to be ill, having these viruses. On the table 1, there were twins, and I described them as the heavenly twins, because I was introduced to astrology at about 6. We had a family discussion about astrology being a medieval kind of psychology, and the Book of Hours went with the different star signs. So it was a really interesting book, and some of us thought we were true to our star signs, and I picked it up from my family and got aware of the planetary signs. So I thought of these twins as the heavenly twins, Gemini, but they were actually Libra like me. About a couple of weeks after me, towards the end of Libra, and they were impervious to us a bit, because they were very very academically minded, but I later became one of the top readers, not because I was near the top anyway. So they seemed impervious to the rest of us. I wondered if they thought along the same lines as me. And it was intriguing because the other twins I knew were identical and looked identically the same, so they didn't. And that I used to, when we were in assembly, I used to watch the other kids, but mainly I was looking to see if these twins, I was looking for differences and similarities because they were non-identical. But for then, it was important to broaden my horizons by competing with the best readers, and I would ultimately go on to develop new skills by reading factual books, not only about astrology but about dogs, because when the cat got to 17 and he was in a road accident, so we had to put him down. So I got my first dog at 7 just for my birthday, a Shetland sheepdog, and after that I was soon into the dog breeds and learning all the stuff about dogs that I could possibly, all the information I could acquire. I got the TV vet dog book, and I was once I'd got up past the Usborns, I was started to read the Foyles books, and then reading about the nature of dogs and the illnesses they acquired, things like hip dysplasia, by the time I was about 8, really. So at sort of 7, I sort of got myself studying dogs to the extent I knew about 80 different breeds, and then it went up to 120, and I've probably forgotten a bit of it now. And my mind started thinking more complex thoughts and I got my specialist reading areas and hobbies by sticking to factual books, because I was beyond fairy tales and storybooks. Even though I liked them, I liked sort of reading the same books as my peer group, but the Briar and the Rose was only something that interested in me because of the attractiveness of the book and the scarlet. I associated scarlet as a colour with having scarlet fever. I did love discussing dinosaurs, and this was something I thought I'd held on to for too long, but I was into all the big names rather than just getting ladybird books and just using the ladybird books about dinosaurs to improve my reading ability. It was small. I was actually interested in the paleontological side of things, but I wanted to make a break away from the kings and queens of England, to be honest, because we only learnt about it in assembly, but it wasn't taught in depth enough. You wouldn't sort of study it very well in lesson time. It was all about painting and being arts and crafty and making things out of paper mache at 6, or even at 7, the books were kind of Peter and Jane-ish, or fairy tale books, like I've said, but I was into definite time periods such as the Elizabethan age of exploration and discovery, which kids are now at this age, or the gaslit Victorian era, but these lessons seem to stop too soon. And I got into A Traveller in Time, which went on about Francis Walsingham and the Mary Queen of Scots plot. And my auntie had bought it me after I watched it as a serial on the TV with a young Sophie Thompson. And I liked the Didikoy as well. I watched the repeat of it after being intrigued by the bullying and the fact that she was alienated for being different, and the fact that the teacher was just as archaic or ignorant in her viewpoints as kids that wouldn't know any better, really. And then there were some nice teachers, and that was the analogy. And looking back on it, I saw that there was a really young Miriam Margolyes in a small part in that. And I remember the Admiral. So I got that book, but I also got a book which taught me something about history, which was called The Traveller in Time. And I was interested in the gaslit Victorian era, and I read The Mill on the Floss at 8 by George Eliot, and I was reading Oscar Wilde, the fairy tales of Oscar Wilde, which were more advanced than nursery rhymes. And my Auntie Flora used to pick me up to take me back to Washway Road from school, because it was a long walk along Woodhouse Lane when my mum was working. We chatted to Kim, who was a year older, a sandy-haired child who would appear confidently from nowhere walking by. And we spoke about various mythological fables and ladybird books. But most of all, we loved discussing the dinosaurs together, especially the Brontosauri. And I kind of knew they existed more than Father Christmas. I doubted Father Christmas, but I was pretty sure dinosaurs existed. But they looked a bit dragon-like. And I thought, the Brontosauri are nice, they don't scare me. And they're not like Tyrannosaurus Rex, a terrible lizard. But I would find out sooner or later that, just as I suspected, Father Christmas is completely false, and I'd thought of that for a long time. But I was told, no, I was wrong, he does exist. In fact, but in my heart of hearts, I knew the previous year, before 7, that he didn't exist. But they confirmed it and said they'd been telling porkies to me. I was pretty convinced that dinosaurs were an actual real-life dragon. It wasn't just Puff the magic dragon, just a myth. They were real. So that garnered my interest, and this girl who was a bit older used to talk confidently about dinosaurs with my Auntie Flora and me when we walked back. And it was Auntie Meg that played the board games with Uncle David. Well, was with Uncle David when he played board games with Grandma before he died. And I think I'll leave it for now. But my spiritual gifts had given me all these alternative thoughts and dreams before a long time before you'd think. And I've only recently in midlife got my dreams back, but they were very vivid, and I even analysed them back then. So I think I'll leave it for now.